Have you ever wondered how a simple request could change a life? Comment below from where you're watching us as we dive into this moving story, because perhaps you too might find something unexpected amidst a plate of leftovers. I always believed that the silence of the street was the greatest accomplice to my loneliness. Walking among the crooked sidewalks, I saw shop windows that shone brighter than my future, and cars that sped by too fast to notice who I was. The midday asphalt burned my feet through my worn-out sandals, while I counted the coins left in the pocket of my faded pants. There wasn't much to expect from that day, only the certainty that hunger was more stubborn than pride, and that no matter how much I tried to convince myself there was still dignity in asking for help, it was only shame that followed me like an unrelenting shadow. I remember stopping in front of a modest little door, where the smell of freshly cooked rice mingled with the tangy aroma of beans simmering in an old pot. The creak of the door as it opened sounded like a weary sigh, a warning that I wasn't welcome there, or perhaps just a realization that all I needed was the courage to cross that threshold. I entered with my head bowed, staring at the cracks in the wooden floor that told stories of families, shared lunches, laughter that no longer existed. That's when I saw her, sitting at a simple table wearing a floral apron, and with a gaze so distant it seemed lost in another time. She was the elderly widow everyone knew by sight, but few truly knew. Her white hair fell in gentle waves over her thin shoulders, and her hands, those hands that had once been strong enough to carry bags, raise children, comfort grandchildren, now rested on her lap, as if holding the weight of memories that no longer fit in her heart. "Can I eat the leftovers, ma'am?" I dared to ask, my voice choked with the shame that burned in my chest. I braced for disapproval, a sigh of disdain. A door slammed in my face, but what I found was a gaze so profound it made me feel naked before my own hunger. She raised her eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream, and in that moment something happened. Something I can't explain, but that felt bigger than hunger itself. The seconds stretched like invisible elastic bands, and in that span of time I saw the reflection of everything I had lost. My dignity, my faith in people, the trust that someone could see me as more than a beggar. But in that gaze, there was something more. A miracle, perhaps. A miracle that had nothing to do with multiplying loaves, but with multiplying compassion. She didn't say anything right away. She just looked at me, her eyes filling with tears that didn't fall but shone like tiny stars in a dark night. In the lines of her face, I saw the map of an entire life. A love that left too soon, children who moved to other cities, perhaps grandchildren who visited occasionally, bringing gifts and leaving too quickly to notice the emptiness left behind. And there, between one wrinkle and another, was a story of losses I didn't yet know, but that somehow connected me to her. I took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling that crept up my legs like a cursed fever. Inside I was screaming, "Please, Mum, help me, even if it's just with what's left on your table." But on the outside, I could only keep my gaze lowered, as if the cracks in the floor were my only home. Then she stood up. With slow, almost ritualistic steps, she walked to the small kitchen just behind the room. With each step, the creaking of the floorboards reminded me I was invading a space that wasn't mine, that I had no right to occupy. But she said nothing. She simply walked with that dignity only those who have lost everything know, as if each movement was a silent declaration that life was still worth living. She returned with a plate in her hands. It was a simple, chipped porcelain plate, but in that moment, it seemed like a treasure. Inside it, remnants of rice mixed with beans, some sautéed collard greens, and a small piece of nearly dried-out meat. A feast for someone who no longer knew what it was to have a full plate. She extended the plate toward me with trembling hands, and in that gesture I felt as if the dignity I had left in some dark alley of the city was being returned to me. "My husband used to say that leftovers tell truer stories than feasts," she said, her voice hoarse from a lifetime of tears. "Because in leftovers are the pieces no one wanted, but that still have flavor, still have value. And I think you deserve a story that still has flavor." The tears I had been holding back with all my strength came like a disobedient river, flooding my face, wetting my unshaven beard. The sound of them hitting the floor seemed as loud as thunder. I wanted to thank her, to say something that did justice to that gesture, but the words escaped me, because there, among the leftovers of a simple meal, I found something greater than food. I found humanity. I sat at the table with trembling hands, the plate before me like a sacred relic. Each spoonful was a confession that I was still human, that hunger hadn't taken everything from me. As I ate, she sat across from me, watching me with that gaze that seemed to pierce through skin and see the soul. A heavy silence settled between us, but it wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of compassion, of sharing, of what doesn't need to be said to be felt. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the simple flavor of that rice and beans mix with the salty taste of my tears. I remembered a time when I too had someone waiting at home, someone who told me to have faith, to not give up, to believe that God still cared about me. But life is a road full of potholes, and sometimes we stumble and don't know how to get back up. When I opened my eyes, she was still there, her hands clasped on the table, as if praying for something that could no longer be fixed. I wanted to ask about her story, but the words stuck in my throat. Still, in that shared silence, something inside me began to change. It was as if in that moment I had learned that true kindness doesn't ask questions, doesn't demand explanations. It simply offers what it has, even if it's little. The sound of the spoon hitting the plate was almost a sad song, but somehow there was a rhythm to it, as if each clink was a beat in our shared story. I remembered when I was a child, and my mother, exhausted from work, would say that the best moments in life happened in the kitchen, not at the fancy stove or with polished silverware, but in the dented pot, in the smell of spices that clung to clothes, in the knowing glances between the one cooking and the one waiting. Perhaps that's why, as I savored those leftovers, each spoonful carried the taste of a lost childhood, of a time when I still believed the world was good. She watched me with patience, her eyes glistening with stories time hadn't erased. I noticed the trembling of her hands and the faint creak of her chair as she shifted to speak. "You know," she began, her voice hoarse like the creak of an old door, "I also know what it's like to ask, and I know what it's like to refuse. I've often found myself holding the door shut to keep others out, as if the little I had was so precious it couldn't be shared." She sighed, and I saw in her not just a woman but an entire life of struggles and scars. My husband died on a cold morning, one of those where the wind slips through every crack. He coughed a lot, and I didn't have money for medicine. It was as if each breath of his was a farewell. When he was gone, I was left with this silence haunting me, like a stray dog that won't leave me alone. I thought I'd go mad, that no one would knock on my door again. But you knocked. I wanted to say I hadn't come to knock on her door. I had come to knock on anyone's door who could give me something to eat, something to quiet my stomach. But in that moment, I realized that somehow I had knocked on the right door. Fate has a way of doing that. Sometimes it takes us to places we'd never think to go, and it's there that we find what we needed most. With each word she spoke, I felt the air grow heavier, laden with memories that weren't just hers, but mine too. The smell of beans mixed with the sound of the wind outside transported me to dark alleys, to nights of interrupted sleep, to tears that mingled with the dust of the street. I knew what it was to lose, knew it better than I wished. And so, each of her stories was an open wound that hurt in me too. "I had children," she continued, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "2 boys and a girl. But they grew up, went on with their lives. They send Christmas cards, sometimes call, but it's like I'm just a memory to them, a memory that occasionally shows up to ask for a blessing, ask for advice, but never to stay." She lowered her gaze, and I saw a loneliness so deep it made me shudder. It was as if in that moment I realized that hunger wasn't just mine, it was hers too. The hunger for company, for a hug, for someone who would stay, who would say, "I'm here." And that made me see that in that house, at that table, I wasn't the only one who had come seeking something. She too was asking in her own way, asking not to be forgotten, asking to be seen. I lifted my eyes from the plate, took a deep breath, and tried with a trembling voice to ask, "Don't you ever feel afraid of sharing the little you have?" She smiled in a way so sad it seemed the smile might break. "Oh, my son," she said, and in that "my son" I felt a sweetness I hadn't heard in years. Fear, I've had it. Fear of not having enough, fear of not being enough. But after you go through pain, you understand that the little we have is enough for those who have even less. Her words hit my chest hard, like a bell ringing the right hour. It was as if suddenly I had woken up to the fact that this woman, who seemed so fragile, was stronger than I could ever be. Because she wasn't afraid to share the little she had, while I had always been afraid even to share my tears. At that moment the wind blew hard outside, and the window creaked. A hollow, almost melancholic sound filled the room. She turned her face toward the window and said, "That wind reminds me of the sound of an empty house after they all left, but it also reminds me that the door still opens. I can still welcome someone." A silence so profound followed that I could hear the ticking of the old clock hanging on the wall, marking time like a hammer, reminding me that nothing lasts forever. I finished eating, realizing I had devoured the leftovers as if they were my last meal. She noticed and, with a kindness that broke me inside, reached out her wrinkled hand, grasping mine with firmness. "Thank you for not being ashamed to ask," she said, "because that reminds me that I shouldn't be ashamed to help." I felt a lump in my throat, a mix of gratitude and pain I didn't know how to express. The words stayed trapped, suffocated by the weight of the reality I carried on my shoulders. But somehow, I think she understood. Maybe it was the gentle squeeze of my hand. Maybe it was the teary gaze I couldn't hide. In that moment, I realized I had learned more from a meal of leftovers than from all the feasts I'd ever had in my life. I learned that sometimes the greatest wealth lies in the gaze of the one who shares, not in what is shared, and that a plate of food can be more than sustenance. It can be a hug, a forgiveness, a piece of dignity restored. She released my hand and stood up, walking with that slowness that made me want to help, but which I knew would be disrespectful to interrupt. She went to the old cabinet, opened the door, and took out a small cloth bundle. She returned to me and said, "I've kept this for a long time, but I think it's time to give it to someone who needs it more than I do." She placed the bundle in my hands, as if handing over a piece of herself. The cloth, worn by time, carried the smell of the house, a faint scent of aged wood mixed with the aroma of spices and memories. I unwrapped it carefully, as if it were a gift too fragile to tear. Inside I found a few old coins, so worn they seemed to have lost the shine of when they passed from hand to hand, buying necessities, holding stories of exchanges and sacrifices. There was also a small medal of Our Lady, its face worn by the touch of fingers that had prayed far more than they had asked. "I kept this for years, thinking one day I'd need to sell it, but today I understand that you're the one who needs it now," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper that seemed afraid to be heard by the wind. I felt the weight of those coins and the medal as if they were more than objects. They were the sum of an entire life, a faith stitched into every breath, a last piece of love that still lingered within her. I held that gift with a care I had for almost nothing in life. It was like holding the hand of someone who trusts you even without truly knowing you. I thought about giving it back, saying I didn't need it, but I didn't have the courage. It was more than charity. It was an offering of hope, and I couldn't refuse hope. She looked at me with a smile so faint it was almost imperceptible, yet it lit up the room with a light that didn't come from any lamp. "Go in peace, my son," she said. "And don't forget that even in leftovers, there's always something that can save us." Her words, so simple and so profound, were etched in my mind like a hymn of resilience. I rose from the chair with trembling legs, the empty plate, and a full heart. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last, as if I carried not only my own pain, but hers as well. I turned to look one last time at that room, at that white-haired woman with trembling hands. I felt an almost desperate urge to stay, to hear more, to help her carry the silence that surrounded her. But something told me that, in that moment, what she needed wasn't my staying, but my leaving. The certainty that what she had done was enough to change someone's world, even if it was just mine. On the way back to the street, the wind blew hard, messing up my hair and bringing the smell of the city. Car exhaust, hot dust, the noise of horns mixed with the laments of beggars who, like me, sought dignity in the corners left behind. I held the bundle tightly, feeling the warmth of the coins and the coldness of the medal, like embers and snow at the same time. Each step was a challenge, to move forward, knowing the world hadn't changed, but I had. I walked to a small square where I often sat to rest. The trees swayed as if dancing to a song only they could hear. I sat on a wooden bench, and there, looking at the sky turning orange with the sunset, I realized that woman had given me more than food. She had restored my faith in humanity. I closed my eyes and for a moment imagined what it would be like if every person passing by could experience what I had. The simple taste of the food, the warmth of compassion, the shared silence that needed no words. It was a utopia, I know, but in that moment it felt as real as the wind touching my face. I opened the bundle again and looked at the medal. I ran my finger over its worn surface, trying to feel the warmth of her hands, the strength of the prayers that had once held that chain of faith. I'm not much for praying, but there I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, God, for putting this woman in my path." It might have been the first time in a long while that I truly felt someone had heard me. I pressed the coins and the medal against my chest as if they were armor against despair. I realized that even if the world remained harsh, I no longer felt so alone. I remembered her words, "Even in leftovers, there's always something that can save us." In that moment, I understood that life isn't measured by what's left, but by what's shared, and that often it's in the little we have that we become great. I stood up slowly, feeling the steadiness in legs that had trembled before, and moved forward, ready to start again. Because in the end, it's not what we lack that defines us, but what we're capable of giving, even if it's just a leftover. And as I walked down the street, clutching the bundle against my chest, I decided I would never again pass by someone without truly seeing them, because sometimes a plate of food is just the beginning of something greater, the end